yes, I can just tell you that the amount of destruction that we have seen here, whether in Al-Jazeera building or in any other building that had been targeted during the past 5 days here in the current escalation, had been very devastating for all journalists and as well as residents here in Gaza. Just a minute ago, Al-Andalus Tower building right behind us here had been targeted by at least 4 Israeli F-16 warplanes, missiles, destroying the entire building. This isn't the first time it happens. As we said, this is building number 6, actually. Al-Jazeera Tower today was number 5. We could actually see our fellow journalists from different media outlets there, AAP, Al-Jazeera, and other radio stations, even local media outlets. They've been crying. The devastation was present in their faces. You could actually see the agony as they spoke about what happened. You could actually see some tears in their eyes as they were describing how many years most of them spent in these offices reporting about different incidents, joyful events, as well as devastating events from this poor enclave. Al-Jazeera journalist Khaled Lubad spoke to us today right here on... he was actually crying, talking about how many hours he used to spend in that office there in Al-Jazeera Tower. He said, I've been living here practically, but I spent more hours here during these days, more than I spent in my own home with my family. That's not just, it's not just about Khalid or other fellow journalists from Al-Jazeera. Others have been telling us the same. It's really difficult, specifically in these days as we mark Eid al-Fitr actually here in Gaza. Usually I can tell you that we'd be making stories and reports about how people would be celebrating Eid al-Fitr, the prayers and other stories are usually made during these days, but obviously things have changed and now we are completely forced to change our agendas. By the way, these sounds you guys are hearing are the Israeli gunboats shelling the beaches of the Gaza Strip. As always, like we said, this is what we're reporting right now. Just a few minutes ago, another residential building was targeted in the Zaytun area east of Gaza Strip with a drone missile. Another one in Al-Rimal. The Islamic National Bank, which belongs to the Hamas government here, had just been targeted a few minutes ago in Al-Rimal neighborhood, specifically in Al-Jundi Al-Majhul, which is basically the busiest and most commercial area in the entire city here. These are the news we continue to report now. Of course, you can obviously see how tired journalists looked in the many pictures that had been displayed. But on all media outlets, everybody, all agencies came here today to Al-Jazeera Tower and filmed those journalists as they stood at the door of what used to be their home, as they say, crying. They left their offices even without taking their clothes, most of them. Some of them haven't had any sleep for days during these difficult times in Gaza. We've been seeing people here, regular people, just even fleeing their homes, and as they fled their home, we continue to follow them. We go wherever they go. We go wherever the Israeli planes hit. It's obviously a risky job. This is one of the most difficult careers anybody can choose, obviously, but they all suggest the message that they need to convey to the world, that Israeli atrocities committed in Gaza cannot be silenced, and the message needs to get out there to the entire world, the international community, European Union, Arab countries. The entire globe needs to watch what was happening and what is still happening in this tiny little strip of land in the Mediterranean, where nearly 2 million residents, over 2 million residents, have been living in devastation. By the way, just as we're speaking right now, a rocket was just launched. More rockets are being launched right now because it's midnight. It's past midnight. We know that around 3 hours ago, Rubaida, a spokesperson for Qassam brigades, the wing of Hamas, mocked the Israeli army and gave them 2 hours of relief. They said, basically he tweeted and said that Gazans, basically he said that from 10 p.m. this night until midnight, there will be no rockets fired towards Tel Aviv. And then now, because obviously rockets continue to be fired from Gaza to Tel Aviv. Israeli never stopped its airstrikes, so why should we? This is how the Palestinian resistance factions here have been dealing with this lately. Well, obviously, the last few hours had been very intense. Several airstrikes had been carried out by Israeli warplanes. They targeted 2 apartments in a civilian building named Mushtaha. Luckily, the building was not completely destroyed as people expected, because they had already received a warning from the Israeli military to evacuate not just them but also residents of neighboring building. More injuries and deaths had been reported in other strikes in Al-Shuja'iyya, in Al-Jazeera also, as well as the northern Gaza Strip. Apparently the number has exceeded the expectations here. Israeli continued to target, but not just residential houses and normal civilians and farmlands near the borders, as they've been doing during the past 5 days, but they also focused and intensified their strikes on targeting the launch pads of rockets, because obviously today we knew that Hamas had launched hundreds of rockets towards Israel after they destroyed Al-Jazeera Tower, one of the busiest and most important and significant buildings in Gaza that housed media offices. Among them was, of course, the Al-Jazeera and the AP in Gaza. Hamas had made it clear that they will continue to retaliate these attacks, and Israel is obviously trying to destroy the military capacity of Hamas and other resistance factions. Just a few minutes ago, Haniya, head of Hamas political bureau, was speaking, addressing the Palestinian people in a very enthusiastic way, telling them that this time the history is changing, because obviously there are more links now between Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem. People inside Israel have started to take part. He also said that Israel had thought that by targeting civilians and destroying towers and buildings in Gaza and assassinating leaders here in the resistance in Gaza, they would deter the Palestinian resistance, but obviously they were wrong. He also said that Gaza, which has been besieged for 15 years, is still improving its capacities. It's targeting Tel Aviv. It's imposing a curfew in Israel, in all Israeli settlements, actually. More importantly, just a few minutes ago, in a very bizarre message to the Israeli authorities, Abu Ubaidah, the spokesperson for the armed wing of Hamas, Qassam brigades here, made a tweet first of its kind, and he said that following orders from Chief of Staff of Hamas Qassam brigades, Muhammad Al-Daif, they will lift the curfew they had imposed on Israeli residents for 2 hours from 10 a.m. local time until midnight. So obviously they're just making threats, but in a sarcastic way this time, telling the Israeli settlers and soldiers that they have 2 hours as a nice break until midnight, which suggests obviously that they will continue with the rocket launching right after midnight here. That's when the escalation here erupted in Gaza. Also, they just targeted 2 residential apartments in Mushtaha building. We've mentioned before that Mushtaha building had received a warning from the Israeli army. Residents evacuated. Even people living in neighboring buildings had to evacuate. Obviously, they have just fled their homes and went to seek refuge in UN facilities, just like people in the north have been doing since the day before yesterday. Massacres had been committed. One in a Shati refugee camp, beach camp, another one in As-Salatin in Jabalia yesterday. People are still talking about this until this moment. The house of Hamas leader Khalil al-Hayya was targeted today by Israeli warplanes as well. And just 5 minutes ago, a barrage of rockets was launched towards Israeli settlements. So obviously, both Israeli side and Palestinian factions here continue to exchange fire. We know that talks of a potential ceasefire has been made. There are obviously some efforts specifically from the Egyptian side. Some sources said even that the U.S. administration has started to interfere in that Egyptian proposal. They told us it's not a firm no so far. Negotiations are still undergoing, but there isn't any definitive answer from either side, not Israel, not the Palestinian factions here in Gaza. Injuries have been reported in the last airstrike in Sheikh Radwan as well in Gaza City itself. We can hear the sounds of drones hovering all over the sky constantly. It's basically non-stop. This is actually what a true war zone would look like. People have been describing what's been happening here more of an action movie, like a Hollywood movie. They've never imagined Gaza would witness these days again, specifically after the war of 2014. But I can tell you that based on numbers even, and the scenes we've been seeing during the past few days, this is obviously the worst escalation Gaza has witnessed since 2014. Some nights are even toughest than what used to be 6 years ago. Obviously, both parties continue to exchange fire just to prove to each other that they are improving. Factions here, Hamas specifically, continue to vow to retaliate, targeting of Palestinian civilians here, saying that they have improved their military capabilities over the past 5 or 6 years, and they're trying to prove that they had just entered a new technique, a new suicidal drone that targeted a chemical factory yesterday in Israel. That was obviously an evidence. Today, large-scale rockets had been launched towards Tel Aviv. It's been going haywire over there. Hundreds of rockets, let me say, had been fired so far. Islamic Jihad also had fired a range of rockets. Abu Ali Mustafa, which is basically the armed faction of the PLFP. There is still a certain consensus among Palestinians here and all the Palestinian factions that it is still the only option. The only option is to retaliate the Israeli strikes here, regardless of what might happen. They do not, however, leaders here in factions, political leaders even, are not denying that a potential ceasefire could be reached if only if the Israeli side agrees to the terms of the Palestinian resistance. Of course, these terms are still the same. Even these terms were actually made before the escalation started in Gaza. It's basically for the Israeli army to withdraw from Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, to stop their eviction plan of the residents there, and to obviously ensure the freedom of worship and prayer for the worshippers there in Al-Aqsa Mosque. That is basically the last update here in the field, but I can tell you that things are getting worse by the minute as we speak. Any place can be targeted. Every inch is a potential target for the Israeli warplanes here in Gaza. I think the concept of security is no longer present here. People are still afraid. They have no places to hide in, not even parks, not even hospitals, because health facilities have been targeted during the past few days as well. So basically, everywhere is threatened.